let's do the brief history of scaling. So that you have psychological and psychophysical measurement. So psychophysical measurement was before or preceded psychological measurement. And I'm going to talk to that a little bit, give you some background, right? So Stevens, in his Handbook of Experimental Psychology in 51, he lays out this idea of psychophysical scaling. So he advanced that whole idea and concept, and it was very seminal in terms of a foundation for psychometrics or mental measurement today. And as I said, he, of course, published those papers on the measurement scales as part of his work in the mid-20th century. Then this slide is a duplication of the one we talked about earlier before lunch. But again, it's just reminds you of the different traditions we're talking about. Test score tradition, scaling tradition, structural tradition. One other thing I should mention here before I leave this slide. So in the test score tradition, so an important historical thread is this. So in 1881, there was a person over in London, in England, and his last name was Edgeworth. And he's the one that was responsible or is responsible for first identifying that there's a normal type curve of errors when you do mental measurement, mental responses or responses from test questions. So the whole idea of the normal curve linked to the idea of an underlying ability continuum goes all the way back to him. Okay, so remember, that's way before the scaling tradition came on. This was something like you answer these set of questions, and the ones you get right give you a number correct score out of, say, the 20 questions. So it's very much a classical test theory, an initial approach at trying to figure out what's the error distribution in mental type measurement that's not direct. Okay, it's sort of indirect, right? Type measurement. Okay, so one other thing about this is measurement evolved in psychology and in the psychological type sciences. We got more into the scaling tradition, and so then it was important to have models that were testable, and like I said earlier today in this presentation, that so we could either reject them or support them, rather than just saying, oh, well, here's a collection of items, and they may have been carefully written and all that, but here's the idea. If you have a collection of items and you just use a sum score for number correct, and you say, well, that's their ability or that's their proficiency, it's kind of a weak or shaky theoretical set of underpinnings, right? I mean, it makes a lot of people uncomfortable, I should say, kind of in general, because it's not some testable theory or model underlying this approach to scoring and scaling. Okay, so it's been criticized on that level somewhat, and all of these models and instruments we use, even today, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, are criticized when we just use sum scores or average scores for attitude measures, like Likert scaling and things like that. And the criticism is it's not a testable, refutable, strong type model for the scoring. Okay, so does that make sense to everybody? It's kind of an important thing you need to realize. Is everybody okay with that? Okay, yeah. So by comparison, if we use a scaling approach, like this is when Gutman entered the stage, in the mid 20th century, he's saying, he's a rigorous person. He's saying, well, we need an actual model that's testable, not just, they get this many questions right. So that's their total score, that's their sum score, and that's their proxy for their attribute or their latent attribute, if you will. So the scaling tradition has tried to overcome the weaknesses in many ways of this just test score tradition. Okay. So that's just some important context for you. So that's why sometimes you hear, oh, modern test theory is based on item response theory or Roche theory or something like that. Whereas classical test theory is not modern test theory. And those are the big differences, what I just described. One's testable, stronger model, one is not.